Welcome to the Inland Valley Storytellers. My name is John St. Clair, and I'm the leader of this group and your Zoom host as well. We have a nice group here tonight, and we already did our introductions without the recording, but now we will start the story. So who would like to be first? Okay, Glenn.
Is Nick here?
He's in the restroom.
Oh. You want me to wait so he introduces himself? Some small talk or?
No, because we already started. So stand up here and tell me where to position this so that you're.
Where you can see me? I'm tall.
Don't need to adjust or you can.
No, yeah, you can see me.
Okay.
Myself on camera, but yeah, you can see me.
I have the volume all the way turned up. Okay, go.
So I brought my props. What the hell is he doing with a baseball and a bat? So my name is Glenn Grant, and I'm going to tell a story. I told this story years ago, a little bit of a twist. This is a folk tale. John will appreciate that, finally, a folk tale. And it's from the author Pleasant Disdain, from a book on storytelling that really resonated with me. I think when I joined this group 10 years ago or so, I got that book. And the name of the story is Old Joe and the Carpenter, American Folktale. And I think it's a story that for me moves me because it's a story about friendship and the power of friendship. Old Joe lived out on a farm. And this farm had been in his family for generations. Generations it's been there. And it was in a small town. So it was the type of community where your neighbor also had a farm. And as such, his best friend lived next door on the accompanying farm. And because this farm had been in the family for generations, they decided to do something unique. They'd been lifelong friends since they were little. They grew up on the farms together. And as the generations go by, of course, they would then raise families of their own. And old Joe and his friend decided that their love of baseball would see them build what in essence would become a field of dreams on this farm. And so they did that. Old Joe and his neighbor, they both had kids and a growing family, and they both shared this passion for American baseball. So they built this field of dreams, and it was there that old Joe and his friend, his lifelong friend, would raise their children to love the same game and just have a lot of fun in this just unique part of this small town. The years would go by and old Joe would see their kids be raised. The kids would then finally leave the farm and they would go raise families of their own and move away and move into the city. And as the years went by, at some point, at some stage of life, old Joe was just left with his best friend. Both of them shared many things in common, including their spouses had passed away. And so all he had was this family farm and his friendship with his next door neighbor, his lifelong pal. And many a time was spent just talking about their love of baseball and watching baseball and talking about baseball. And they got along great. They've been friends for years. Until suddenly one day, just ironically out of nowhere, they had a bit of an argument. There was an old building, kind of like I guess you'd call it a barn. And out from that, they both shared different calves and cows and would raise things together. But one day the neighbor said, you know, that calf that's on your property, that's my calf. And for some reason, old Joe decided to be stubborn about it. I said, no, that's my calf. That belongs to me. And this little innocuous argument started out of nowhere. And suddenly the days went by. The neighbor stormed off and no longer was talking to old Joe over a simple calf. I guess the English would say we got into a row. So they had a row. And as the days went by, The neighbor still wasn't talking to old Joe until one Saturday morning there was a knock at the door. And he wasn't expecting anyone. And when he answered the door, what stood in front of him was a young man with a warm smile on his face, a bit of a twinkle in his eye. He had a tool belt posted over his shoulder and a warm, infectious smile. And he said, "I'm sorry to bother you on a Saturday morning, but I'm traveling through town and I'm a young carpenter and I've got lots of energy and lots of talent. And if there's any job that you could give me on your farm, I promise you I could do a great job for you. Just any job you can give me. Promise I'll do a good job." And the young carpenter looked friendly. So old Joe brought him into the house. They sat down at the kitchen table. And he had some stew that was on the stove and some fresh bread. And he gave the young carpenter a meal and a fresh pot of coffee. And he asked the young carpenter, "So tell me about your journey. You're traveling through town. You're a carpenter, so you have these skills, but tell me about your life." And as he started to unpack his life a little further, old Joe started to think. And he thought about it for a minute. And he said, "You know what? I think I do have a job for you. Come here. I want you to look through my kitchen window. Do you see that creek that's now running down my property line? Well, that creek wasn't here a week ago. In fact, my neighbor put that creek in just to spite me. So I tell you what, I do have a job for you. I do have a job for you. I want you to build me the biggest fence. I don't want to see that creek, and I don't want to see my neighbor. I want you to build me the biggest fence you can build me." Well, the young carpenter thought about it for a minute. He said, "I can do that. I promise you, Joe, I'll do a great job." And so old Joe got the young carpenter and they went out to the barn and where he had some materials. And he realized he's asking the young carpenter to build a huge, long, tall fence so he doesn't see his neighbor. He realized he's going to have to go into town and get some supplies. So he said, "You know what? I'll tell you what. You start on my fence. I'm going to go into town." Old Joe jumped on that time his buggy and his horse, and they rode off into town to get more wood and supplies for this giant fence that he was going to build. So he was gone for a few hours, and sure enough, the young carpenter grabbed his tool belt and his tools, and he got right to work. And boy, did he do a fine job, masterful job. A few hours went by, and old Joe was coming back into town, and he noticed when he rode into his property, there in the distance was this beautiful bridge that this young carpenter had built. And it was on one side of his neighbor's property and went over the creek onto his side and had these beautiful handrails. And the young carpenter had a smile on his face. And as old Joe approached the bridge, there on the center part of it was his neighbor. And the neighbor had a warm smile on his face and his hand was outstretched. And as Joe approached, he said, "You know, Joe, I'm so happy you had this young man build this bridge. You know what? I could care less about the calf and the argument we had. That doesn't matter. I just want to be friends again, and I'm happy that we're going to be friends and that you got this to be built." And old Joe was just mind blown. He couldn't believe that this gorgeous bridge and all that anger over that silly little argument about whose calf was on whose farm went away. And the two men met at the top of the bridge and gave each other a warm embrace, these lifelong friends that had grown up together and raised their families together and had been through so many trials and tribulations together, were now reunited again in friendship. And just then, suddenly, old Joe realized that the young carpenter was starting to walk away. And as he walked away, he said, "But wait, I've got so many more projects for you. You're amazingly talented. Between my neighbor and I, we could keep you busy for so long." And of course, the young carpenter looked back at old Joe and he said, "You know, I'd like to stay, but I've got more bridges I need to build." And with that, he took his tool belt, put it over his shoulder, and went on his way. And the moral of the story is the power to illuminate deep friendships. And that sometimes our friendships can have a row or they can go by the wayside, but it's our lifelong friends that will always keep us here. And with that, that, I'm happy to say I brought one of my lifelong friends here tonight. For my first time at our monthly event, he's been to our celebration, but that's the story of Old Joe and the Carpenter. Thank you. I did it, I put this together tonight because of my not lifelong friendship, I've known Jason for many years, 25 years. So that's a story to celebrate our friendship. There you go.
Next. Do you have a story?
Sure, I was planning to go maybe a little bit later, but let me.
Well, I just thought maybe you could introduce yourself because you weren't here when
Oh, well,
we already all introduced ourselves. If you want to tell your story later, you could do that. But
sure, 1 second.
tell us who you are. I wonder.
Well, my name is Nick Smith. And sorry for running late, but my train was late of all things. You don't expect that because they have to keep to the schedule, and keep forgetting other trains, but they were willing to make that risk apparently.
Glad you can
I can tell the story.
Okay. So here is Nick Smith.
Now, I was thinking about the fact that this year in particular, Christmas and Hanukkah pretty much coincide. And I do have a story related to that comes from the hometown of part of my family. You see, a number of years ago, over 30 years ago, I ran across a book, and it was about an old barber who was also a sculptor. He did wood sculptures, and he was kind of like, I don't know how you can explain this, but he was sort of like, have you ever seen the artwork of Grandma Moses, that kind of thing? Well, imagine that with very precise wooden miniature pieces. And so that was his hobby. His profession was being a barber. He was an African-American barber in Columbus, Ohio, part of the community there for many, many years. But he had struck up a friendship with a boy from one of the local neighborhoods, a young Jewish boy. And they got to talking and sharing all the time. And the boy got to look at the little pieces of sculpture. Because I don't know if you know this, but African-American barbers have a secret back room. You see, they do all of their work in the front room, but they've got something in the back room that's only for people they like to go and see. The barber that I went to as a kid, what he had was the early Marvel comics, the start of the story of the Hulk and Spider-Man and things like that. And customers that he liked could go back there while they were waiting for their haircuts and read these comics. Well, Elijah, that was his name, he had some of the carved pieces in his back room. And Michael, this boy, got to go see them, even though most kids were not allowed back there, because these were such precise pieces. To give you an idea, he did a Noah's Ark scene and carved as many animals as he could figure out how to carve, and he set them up. He did not only a nativity scene, he did a crucifixion scene that was so detailed that the dice the legionnaires were using to play dice were carved individually, this big. And so only his real friends could get to see these usually. Occasionally he'd give a piece away or sell it, but most of the time they were just in his back room. Well, one year, at Christmas time, he presented a little package to Michael. And Michael couldn't figure out what this was because his family celebrated Hanukkah, not Christmas. Nobody had ever given him a Christmas present before. And when he took it home, it was beautiful when he opened it. And yet, he was also kind of horrified because he wasn't sure if he could accept it. You see, Elijah had made Michael the most beautiful carved wooden angel. And Michael had been told all his life that that might be, like a graven image or something, because you didn't have things like that. You didn't have angels and Hanukkah bushes. You didn't, and so he wasn't sure he could accept it, and he was afraid to ask his parents because he thought maybe they would say yes, maybe they would say no, and if they said no, he'd have to take it back to Elijah, and he didn't know what to do. Well, he thought, and he thought, and he thought, and finally, he thought, I know the rabbi who teaches us. He'll be able to give me an answer, and my parents still won't know. And so he went to the rabbi and asked, is it all right if I accept a gift that's in the shape of a Christian angel? And the rabbi laughed. And he said, in return for such a gift, you should give that person what you made in the crafts class. The crafts class. What he? Oh, he'd made a wooden menorah in the crafts class that they'd been having. And he thought, but it's not as good as the angel. And the rabbi said, your heart is as good as the heart of the person who gave it to you, isn't it? And he thought, and he said, I hope so. Well, he wrapped it and took the package back to Elijah. And Elijah looked at it and said, I wasn't expecting anything from you in return. And Michael said, someone very wise told me I should give this to you. And Elijah opened it and looked at the menorah. Oh, it wasn't as finely carved as the angel or the things that he had made, but this was something from the hands of a boy he really liked, a friend. And so he took it and put it up on a shelf back where his carvings were, so that only the special people would get to see it and hear the story of how it came to pass. But that's not the end of the story. You see, as I said, part of my family came from Columbus, Ohio. And for various reasons, I hadn't been there since I was a kid because, frankly, the weather in Ohio is not my cup of tea. And I was invited to be a guest at a music conference back there. And so I was flown back to Columbus, and I said, okay, but I have one request. I'm going to get there early. I don't have any responsibilities at the conference till that evening. Could I spend the daytime in downtown Columbus? I want to go to the museum there. Well, the people who were giving me my transportation were absolutely puzzled because the Columbus Museum is not a renowned museum, okay? To give you an idea, it's got this little tiny walkthrough that gives you a voiceover of their famous collection, which is about 6 pieces. But the fact was that I had heard that some of Elijah's carvings were there in the collection and were on display. And so I got to see them. And there they were. Oh, the Noah's Ark wasn't there. They thought it was still in storage because it was an enormous number of little pieces. But one of his jungle scenes was, he had carved a jungle scene with monkeys this big, where the tails were curled and could hang from the bushes, and where the details, the eyes were painted so that you could see where they were looking. And the crucifixion scene that he had done was on display. And you could see it there, complete with the little teeny tiny dice that the Legionnaires were gambling with. But more importantly, it had information about his life and his passing and where his barbershop was. I don't know for sure that it was the barbershop that my family went to, but it was close enough that it might have been. And I often wonder if the members of my family were friendly enough with him that they got to see the pieces while they were in the back room. Because not everybody did. It was only for people he especially liked.
Thank you, Nick. That was wonderful.
Oh, by the way, the book that led me to that story really does exist. It's called Elijah's Angel. And the young boy, Michael, grew up to be a writer and a collage artist.
Cool. Very interesting. Okay, who would like to be next? Ron?
I'm going to tell this story Thursday night for the Sacred Storytelling Show for the California Association of Storytellers. I never tell this story because I always feel like it's a little too far Christian for most of the audiences I tell to. So if that will offend you, sorry about that. The Legend of Bernardo's Gold. In the hills above Cumbria, there lived a farmer, a landholder. He lived there on his land, grew his crops and his animals, and mostly kept to himself. His family had perished in a fever that passed through, and he had just sort of withdrawn into his own land, which wasn't really his own land because it had been his father's land and his grandfather's land and his great-grandfather's land. Of course, he obeyed the rules and attended all the festivals required of the Roman conqueror's faith, as his ancestors had done for the Greeks who had conquered, as their ancestors, in time out of mind. But mostly he worshiped his land and his animals. And his life might have gone that way to the end of his life. But in the fall of one year, he was looking down the trail that led off toward Cumbria, where he was going in a few weeks, and he saw something moving. Upright, like a man, but seeming staggering back and forth. He hurried down the trail, and he found a man in strange clothes who was clearly quite ill. He helped him up to the top, brought him into his house, he fed him, nursed him slowly back to health, and as they began to speak more of themselves, he said, I am here spreading the word of a different kind of religion. There's a faith growing across the Roman Empire. It is not based on stone goddesses or ancient legends. It's a story of a man who taught about love and caring for your neighbors and taking care of others. And he began to tell him the stories out of the Bible, telling the stories of this Jesus of Nazareth, telling how he met a woman at a well, telling how he found ways to forgive all and heal those who needed it most. Before he left that next spring, he christened him Bernardo, of Cumbria, and said, share the word if you get a chance, and went on his journey. He didn't talk to very many people. Oh, he'd say a few things for a neighbor here and there, and he went down to town and did his business, but he was not a sociable person, so he took to telling the stories that he had heard to the animals. He would say, oh, playful and fractious sheep, lambs. Hey, once the children wanted to come to him, and the disciples tried to keep them away, and Jesus said, well, suffer not the little children. Isn't that a beautiful story? As he told the stories, he began to work them around to where they seemed to fall together in a sequence from birth to works to death to resurrection. But his absolute favorite was the story how Jesus, while lying in the manger, had all the animals kneel before him. And he became convinced that if he could find his way to Bethlehem, wherever that was in the great empire, and were there on Christmas Eve, he would see this miracle himself. He had not worked for profit in quite some time. He had gotten what he needed to get through each year and been happy with that, but he had some gathered treasure, and he began to work in earnest. His flocks increased, his crops increased. His time was spent gathering money, because he was told by the ship people down in Cumbria that to reach this place, he would need 9 pieces of gold. 3 for the journey there, 3 for the journey back, and 3 as a gift to the Christ child. It took him several years, but slowly the coins were acquired, and he began to make plans to leave his animals with his neighbors and leave his land fallow for a year and to find his way to Bethlehem to be there for the Christmas miracle. All was ready. His plans were made. He would leave the next morning. But as he looked down the trail that evening, someone was coming up from below, small and stumbling. He hurried down, and there he found a boy, no more than 8 or 9. He picked him up, and he was bleeding from many small wounds. And he realized it was a runaway slave, but never had he seen anyone so abused. And this child was too young to have deserved any of this. He carried him up and began to nurse him back to health. And as he got to him, he began to tell him the different stories. And he thought, perhaps he can work with me. Maybe we can work things out. And he was beginning to think, okay, we can make this happen, when marching up the trail from below came a Roman soldier looking for the escape slave. He looked at the child and thought, I mustn't let this happen. He took his 9 gold coins and said, you found his body, didn't you? Well, of course, the Roman soldier thought that was a grand plan. And he went on. And Bernardo said, we will have to work harder. I will have to work harder. I will go, but now we'll have to wait as I raise this child. And so once again, the crops were raised and things were sold and the animals were expanded and the child helped out and his property expanded, his wealth grew. And finally, after a couple of more years, he had 9 gold coins gathered again. And he thought, it will be well. My son can keep the land and the animals and the crops going. He can even hire people if he must. And I will go and I will see the miracle, and then I will come back and we'll live out our years together. He had left his house and was walking down toward Cambria, when coming toward him was a whole caravan of people. Many of them were wearing robes, such as his friend Santiago had worn when he came up the trail years before. He stopped and waited. A priestly man holding a cross said, we have heard that the great Santiago stopped here one night for a while, and we'd like to build a church in honor of Jesus Christ. Well, of course, Bernardo said, he was my friend. I'm glad he is well known. You're going to build a church here in my valley? Yes, we'll have to buy land and work things out, but we will get it done. You needn't buy land. Hey, I have a lovely piece of land currently under crop, but it would be perfect for building your church, and I will give it to you. Churches are expensive. Once they had their first sacred service on the land that he had donated, they began to try and think about how to do it. And the sacrist was saying, we need donations from the community to try and build up our church and begin the church. And once again, he took his leather purse with its 9 gold coins and put it in his hand and said, this was intended for Christ. He worked there with them. His hands were strong, but he was no longer young. He worked with their crops, he worked with their gardens, he worked with the carpenters, and always, he never missed a single service, which happened 4 times a day sometimes. But he began to get a little upset with some of it. Oh, yes, preach the death and resurrection, but why are you not talking more about the miracle, the amazing miracles that take place every year in Bethlehem? Why is the story not shared? But no one would answer him, for he was just an old peasant. Time wore on. Years went by. He grew old. He could no longer work in the fields. He took care of the flower gardens and some of the vegetable work and was very good with the sheep and goats. Some of the younger members would say, he is older than the trees. Why is he still here? Why does he always prattle so much about Bethlehem? What does this all about? Time wore on. It was Christmas time again. He had gone to midnight mass. But when he left the church, he hadn't gone back to his quarters. He just stood by and watched as the sacristan turned the key and hung it on the hook, and went off to his sleep. Then he went out to the barn. He told the animals the story. Somehow they seemed to understand. He walked back to the church, opened the door, and went inside. Walking down the aisle, he was followed by ox and ass, sheep and goat, and all of them gathered in front of the altar. He looked up at the carved measures, the things that were there, and looked up and thought, this is the night the animals are here. Suddenly there was a radiant light. Bernardo, you have done well, came a voice from behind. As the priests came out near dawn for the early morning service and came inside, they were astounded to see the animals from the barn, still and quiet as could be, looking toward the altar. There on the ground was Bernardo. Hey. The other priests and acolytes were called in. They looked at this scene, and one of them said, what is that? What is he holding? They reached forward, and there was an old leather purse with 9 gold coins. The sacrist said, that is like the gift he gave to the church years ago. And the priest said, we have truly been part of a miracle. But the rest of that next year, those that had the skills for it carefully carved and painted and marked. And that year in December, for the first time anywhere, a carved wooden nativity was placed, beautifully made. So whenever you see a nativity anywhere in the world, think back to Bernardo, a man of simple faith and care.
Thank you, Ron. That's a great story. I love to hear that. So, you got one too, Ron?
Thank you. The only claim to the story that I would like to tell you is that my middle name is Thomas. And there are 2 famous Thomases, and I'm not one of them. But the one that most easily comes to mind would be Ellen Thomas. And of course, of all of the stories that he wrote and told, and the poetry even more voluminous, probably A Child's Christmas in Wales is the most well known. So why not risk it? Because it's a story that's not mine, and it's in a way a story not his. He's telling a story about the way in which Christmas used to be in his youth. And those of us who are an hour or 2 older than the rest of us know that the more that you try to remember then, the less that you're going to be able to say now about what it was then. But in any event, one Christmas was so much like another in those days around the sea town Clonmel, and out of all sight and sound except the occasional voices that I sometimes hear in the moment before I sleep. But I never knew whether it was when I was 6 days and 6 nights and it snowed for 12, or whether it was 12 days and 12 nights and it really snowed for 6. You see, all the winters and summers and Christmases boil down into one. And out come, in this story, memories of being in that two-town corner now in the south of Wales. And there along the sea, where it was always fish freezing weather, and the water was so cold, the snow was even colder. So to remember all of this, I have to plunge my hands deep into the snow and pull out whatever I can to remember. And of course, the first thing that comes to mind is Mrs. Prothero and the fireman. It was on the afternoon of the day of Christmas Eve, and I was in the garden with her son, Jim. We were there waiting for cats. Cats, yes. Cats mysterious, cats sneaky, cats slinky, cats not always reliable. So we waited to snowball cats. The wise cats never appeared. They were so wise and so distant that they knew when to stay away. And they stayed away whenever we arrived. We always had our snowballs ready. We were so dressed and mounted for all of this. We were, as it were, Arctic beaded marksmen with great boots and warm coats, because of course the snows had been ever present since eternity, last Wednesday. And we were always ready for the snowing of the cats. But the cats, as I say, never arrived. But we were always ready. And one day in the garden, as we listened very carefully for the cats to appear, there was another sound. It was brilliant, but distant, and I couldn't quite make it out. Fire, fire, said Mrs. Prothero, and she beat the dinner gong. And so we ran down to her house at the end of the garden, and there she was, bombulating with the, calling out for the fire, and everybody was excited, and smoke indeed was coming out of the house. And so with our snowballs all in our arms, we bounded to the house, and smoke indeed was coming out of the dining room. So we stood at the edge of the door of the dining room, and the only thing that we could see was somebody who was going like that, and somebody who was going like that, and somebody who was going like that. And it was the same person. It was Mr. Prothero, who was moving his arms as though he were conducting. Do something, he said. So of course we did. We threw our snowballs into the, I think we missed Mr. Prothero. And Mrs. Prothero said, do something. We ran out to the phone box to call the fire department. And Jim said, and let's call the police as well. And Ernie Jenkins, he likes fires. But we only called the fire department. And soon the fire engine came, and 3 tall men in shiny helmets appeared. And we got out just before they turned their hose on. And I think that Mr. Prothero got out just in time as well. And there it was. And as the fire, which was never seen, but only the smoke, seemed to dissipate, all of a sudden things became very quiet. Because now down the stairs came Miss Prothero. Miss Prothero was Jim's aunt. And we waited very, very carefully and quietly to see what she would say to the firemen, because she said the right thing always. So we stood and we watched as the 3 tall men in their shining helmets, among the cinders and the melting snowballs and the last of the smoke, and she looked at them and she said, would you like anything to read? Years and years ago, when I was a boy, that's the way that it was. And I can't remember even to this day whether it snowed for 6 days and 6 nights when I was 12, or whether it snowed for 12 days and 12 nights when I was 6. maybe Dylan Thomas will tell us.
Anybody else? Jason?
Sure. So, if you had mentioned, my name is Jason. I grew up here in the San Gabriel Valley. Moved with my dad when I was probably junior high school. Lived with my mom in Covina. Grew up pretty chill kind of upbringing. Skateboards, Beastie Boys, typical stuff for the 80s. But I'm starting to realize as I'm listening to your stories that I only tell two types of stories. Very fanciful, very whimsical type of fantasy stories and real stories. So if you guys would be having a little patience tonight, I'd love to share one of each with you, if you wouldn't. So the first one I'd like to share with you is called The Dark Expanse. We are travelers of the dark expanse, like ancient mariners in uncharted waters seeking something just beyond our reach. The stepchildren of history, cast adrift, longing and groping in darkness. Memories of home, like golden diadems that glisten in the distance, on sweet fragrances that evoke ancient memories of the long count on the calendar round. Supernovas and immense galaxies pass like pedestrians on street corners. We're moving faster still. We know this place, but still somehow out of focus. We push deeper in time. We're reaching further back and still stretching forward. I can hear them singing songs of praise and songs of loss. Do you remember when we left the garden? The tears of beautiful maidens and children as they wail and moan for a return, painful stirrings. Still we push on. Casting aside doubts and cares, we are all long suffering and determined to gain ancient knowledge. We long for the king and his arrangement, the promise of prophecy and the acknowledgement of truth. We are all travelers in the dark expanse. Come with us. So as I was thinking back on your celebration, and I've gone to it the past couple of years, the one thing I was sharing with Glenn at dinner is that you guys always have your stories memorized. And I haven't typically been that type of storyteller, but as we were sitting at dinner, I was remembering a story that I was sharing with Glenn a little bit. I'm going to try and share that with you tonight, and it's from memory exclusively. So this is a real story. So I had gotten myself into some trouble. I had a neighbor that I like to joke around and say he had a sleep disorder, but he was into some things that kept him up a lot. And we got to be good friends. And long story short, I developed a very similar sleep disorder. And that went on for probably 5 or 10 years. Ended up in the streets for about 5 years. Long story short, tried to get off the streets for a while. And I like to say through a prayer, ended up getting arrested. And I thought that was kind of the end of my life. I had a couple of small children at the time that I knew I had a debt to them and I needed to be a father to them. Long story short, trying to keep it brief. I got released on a proposition that had come into place and it allowed me to start my life all over again. It was, to me, I knew an answer to a prayer. And as I got released, I really had no plan for recovery and how I would rebuild my life. And through a friend of a friend, I got introduced to an older gentleman. It was interesting. He was a professional house painter. I never saw him not in his painting clothes, always in the white shirt with the white pants. He drove like a 1963, 1964 El Camino that he had always painted himself with rollers. His name was Jimmy Corona, and he was a very interesting fella. And we got to talking, he got to be friends, and he had this uncanny resemblance to my grandfather, who was also a commercial painter. So I immediately fell in love with him. Jimmy knew that I was down on my luck and had offered to let me stay in his living room for $30 a month. And he let me put a little cot in the living room. There I was, starting to rebuild my life. His house was the tiniest house that you've ever seen. It was probably smaller than this room. sat on about a quarter of an acre, and it was all yard of this tiny little dilapidated house at the very back of the yard. Jimmy would come home at the end of every day, completely plastered. Jimmy was a hope to die alcoholic. He was from Chicago originally. I know through some of his stories, I felt like he had some mafia ties, but had ended up here in Southern California, probably because of the weather, and was painting houses to sustain his lifestyle. And again, he would come home from work every night, and I never saw him not drunk, but still was the kindest gentleman, never had any kind of anger, and very generous, right? So the house was a mess, as you can expect an old alcoholic house to be. The floors were black. I remember one day I kind of got it in my head that I wanted to do a kindness, and I started cleaning to the house and realized that it would take an archaeological dig to get down to the original floors. But in the house was just, it was horrible. No actual toilet paper in the house, stacks of old newspapers. I mean, you know, it was a scene. So I was doing telemarketing at the time, and I'd come home after work one day, which I worked right across the street because I had no car and no money. And again, I was just starting to build my life. So Jimmy came home at the end of the day, as he always did. And he had always like a pack of Pall Malls rolled up in his sleeve. And he's one of those guys that was greaser back in the day. He never really let go of it. Full head of white hair. And of course, Jimmy would come home with alcohol and he would start drinking. But again, the depth of his character was amazing. And I think that's one of the things that I enjoyed most about him, other than he reminded me of my grandfather, which I had lost. And he had this old beat up piano in the living room that barely fit in there. And he would come home and just be going at it. He would nod out at times. The cigarette was always burning. So there would be this amazing, like 2 or 3 inch like ash that was just, and it wouldn't fall off. He would just sit there, he'd nod off. But every once in a while he'd come to, and he always had a story for me. It was amazing. Or he would come to, and he would play vaudeville piano for me. It was unbelievable. And it was just, for me, I was sober for the first time in decades. I'm working on myself. Like the world's a new place for me. And this guy is just the most amazing guy for me to interact with. And I felt like, again, I'm having this opportunity to be with my grandfather. So we're in the house the one day, and he's just going to town like he always does. And he nods out, and he's sitting on the bench for the piano. And he would always sit in this way where his legs would be crossed, and he would kind of just have the ashes hanging there. And he kind of came to the one day as we're sitting there, and I'm watching Jeopardy or something on TV. And he comes to, real startled, and he looks at me. And he goes, you know what? He goes, I want to tell you something. And I was like, I could tell whatever it was that was on his mind was going to be unbelievable. And he says, I want to tell you, your brain is an amazing tool. It's an amazing thing. He says, whatever your brain can imagine, he says, it will actually manifest. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm stuck, right? So he says, if your brain decided that it wanted you to be a terrorist, he says, your brain would find ways for you to become that. And he started again elaborating on it. He says, your brain would subconsciously start identifying people that looked like they had those kind of interests, and people that knew how to build bombs and different things. And he ran through this whole scenario. And by the end of this scenario, I couldn't believe what he was telling me, because I knew what he was telling me was real. It was a real thing. And it was weird because during the telling of this story, I kept thinking about weird little references. I keep thinking about nursery rhymes, right? Like merrily, 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 life is but a dream. And I thought, wow, there's some real deep wisdom in what these guys telling me. And he looked at me and took another hit off that Pall Mall, passed out. And I sat there in that living room for the next hour thinking about what he told me and kind of musing on my life and what I had been through, some of the things. And I thought, God damn, this old man really knew some stuff, because 1,000 years ago, I was just a father and a guy working in the newspaper, and had this idea that I wanted to get involved with this thing, right? Which was something I shouldn't have got involved with. And it led me down a path until I eventually became that thing. So much so that I almost ended up in prison for life over it. So again, these thoughts are like strong in my mind. And I feel like ever since that day, I've really owned that idea that life really is, for the most part, what we imagine it to be, who you think you are and who you think you are. The fact that you're all here tonight as storytellers, alludes to the fact that we do manufacture our reality to a great degree, and I believe more than we're even conscious of. So with that story in mind, or that thought, I've carried that forward for the past 15 years. And there's times when I really go, okay, if we're making this thing up, and this is me writing my story, this is my script, right? Who do I want to be? And for me, I feel like I'm always this kind of like a combination of old and new, you know? So I thought, if I'm going to be something, I want to be Cary Grant, and I want to be, you know, like James Bond kind of mixed together. I want the swanky cars, but I want to be, you know what I mean? But it's been interesting because I really do think that if we really pay attention to our lives, and I know if I pay attention to my life, and Glenn and I talk about this for hours sometimes, I definitely believe that the world that we're living in, the life that I've created ever since those moments, ever since Jimmy came to and sprinkled me with wisdom, right? Your life is what you make it up to be. So for me, and I think for all of us in this room, I've tried to dream bigger and tried to imagine such a better version of myself. And you know what I mean? Even people that have come before me, my grandparents and my parents. So I think that the moral of this story for me is that ancient wisdom, like I talked about in my other story, exists all over the place, but we have to have eyes to hear it, see it, and apply it. And if we can do that, we can imagine the world just so much better than we've ever been before. So that's my story off the hip tonight.
Thank you, Jason. Anybody else have a story? Well, I have one. So this is a story I haven't told in a while, and it's a folk tale. And one of the reasons I like folk tales is that you can find the same folk tale in many different cultures with only minor variations. Most cultures in the world have a Cinderella story. Most cultures have a Jack and the Beanstalk story. And the story I'm going to tell tonight I'm using the Russian version of this folk tale, but it exists in various forms in other cultures other than Russian. And this is a kind of story that actually can have some audience participation if you choose to participate. And you're welcome to do so, but do not feel coerced into doing it if you don't want to do it. And the name of the story is Too Much Noise. Many years ago, an old man named Peter lived in a very old house. And this was a very noisy house. His bed squeaked. His floor creaked. The leaves fell on the roof. The tea kettle whistled. Woo! Too noisy, thought Peter. And Peter decided to go into town and ask the wise man what he should do. Well, when he went to see the wise man told Peter to get a cow. What good is a cow? Asked Peter. But he got a cow anyhow, and he took the cow home. Well, now all day long, the cow goes, moo, moo. The bed still squeaked. The floor still creaked. The leaves still landed on the roof. And the tea kettle whistled. Too noisy, said Peter. And he went back into town to see the wise man. Well, the wise man told him to get a sheep. What good is a sheep? Said Peter. But he got a sheep anyhow, and he brought the sheep home. Well, all day long, the sheep went, bah, bah. The cow went, moo. The bed squeaked. The floor creaked. The leaves fell on the roof. The tea kettle whistled. Too noisy, said Peter. And so the next day, he went into town to see the wise man. The wise man said, get a hen. What good is a hen? Said Peter, but he got a hen anyway and brought it home. All day long, the hen went. cow went. The bed squeaked. The floor creaked. The leaves fell on the roof. The tea kettle whistled. Too noisy, said Peter. And the next day he went back to tell the wise man it wasn't working. It was still too noisy. And the wise man said, get a dog and a cat. What good are a dog and a cat, said Peter, but he got a dog and a cat anyhow. Brought him home. All day long the dog went, ruff, ruff, ruff. The cat went, the hen went, bah. The sheep went, bah, bah. The cow went, the bed squeaked, the floor creaked, the leaves fell on the roof. The tea kettle whistled. Too noisy, said Peter. The next day, he was really, really mad. And he stomped in to see the wise man. And he said, I told you my house is too noisy. And you told me to get a cow all day long. The cow goes, you told me to get a sheep all day long. The sheep goes, bah, bah. You told me to get a hen all day long. The hen goes, bah. You told me to get a sheep. Can we do sheep already? A cow. All day long, the cow goes, moo, moo. I'm going crazy. And so the wise man said, let the cow go. Let the sheep go. Let the hen go. Let the dog and cat go. And so Peter went home and he let all the animals go. The bed still squeaked. Oh, what a quiet noise. The floor still creaked. Ooh, what a quiet noise, said Peter. The leaves still fell on the roof. Ah, such a quiet noise, said Peter. The tea kettle still whistled. Ah, I live in a quiet house, and that's too much noise. So I was thinking that that might be a story with all those animals.
Yes.
That would go with the county fair thing, right?
I did invite Kiva and I didn't hear back. I will try again for January.
Okay.
Do you want to explain it again? You want to explain it again? We have more people here.
Yeah, come up to me and tell people, because other people might be interested.
Okay, I volunteer at the LA County Fairgrounds. We have a farm, which is an educational farm. It's organic. We do have chickens, 3 turkeys, and some rabbits. But during the fair, we are open and we're trying to get people to become more aware. All of us are very passionate about the idea of reconnecting people to food. We have school trips, and every time it's somebody will say, that's a chicken. Yes. That's where chicken nuggets come from. Yes. And there's this total disconnect. We are disconnected from the land, we're disconnected from the food we eat. And so we have this beautiful area, which is called the Mid Garden. And at fair time, that's where people can come and sit down and just be quiet, because it is a very noisy place. And my idea was to ask, and we're still sort of going back and forth on it, if people would be interested in coming during the fair time as a group. You know, you can work it out, we can work on the details of it, and tell stories. So you could just, you know, whoever shows up and is sitting there, you can tell stories. And so it's wanting to know who's interested. I had told the farm manager, Kiva, about it, but I don't know if she got my email. So I'll be following up tomorrow and try and get her to come to the January meeting.
Yeah, that'd be great.
To meet all of you. So it's something where it's sort of like, okay, this is an idea, but if you're interested, and you have enough people, you don't have to be there all the time. Another group that I volunteer with is the Master Food Preservers. And we started for the first time this year at the fair. And we did weekends, just one day a week. And that was enough to get us started so that you can see what works, what doesn't work. So if you're interested, this is an idea that's floating around. And it's a lot of fun. And we have absolutely no money, so it's a volunteer. But you do get a free ticket to the fair. And you do get free time.
So Marlene, you envision it, 2 hours worth of stories, rotating 10 minutes.
Yeah. It's however,
16 hours.
however you want to set it up. I mean, we did demonstration for a couple hours at the fair, and then we had an information table. But however you set it up, you can have, a couple of people telling stories in the morning. You really wouldn't want to be there in the evening because the atmosphere really changes. But the kids come in the daytime. And I was the ambassador in the Mint Garden this year. And I was always walking around asking little people where the big people were. So it would be something to, get them. And, you would have almost a captive audience. So if you're interested, think about it. We can talk about how to set it up. You would have to go in and sign, a release waiver. And they would give you your rules, they would give you your badge. We can get you parking. This is one thing we learned this year. We get people parking in the vendor parking place, which means you don't have to walk 2 miles to get there. Because that was a big trek for a lot of people. But it's a nice sheltered area. You're under magnolia trees.
This is in May, right?
This is in May, yes.
So it could get warm.
Yes, it's warm, but it's not horribly hot. So, you could just come, bring your water, set up a rotation of who tells stories. We would like stories to be around farm and food. But folk tales, all kinds of stories would be good. Any questions?
So the story I told tonight.
Tonight I'm sitting there thinking, God, this would be so great.
That's why I decided to tell that story.
Yes, yeah,
To get your feedback.
yes, that would be a wonderful story of noise, of food, growing things. So there's lots of them. Okay. Okay, so I will try next month to get Kiva here.
Okay. And I will have another farm story.
Oh, awesome, thank you.
So is there anybody else that has a story to tell, or are we done with stories? Chris graciously went to Trader Joe's and got some goodies for us.
Thank you, Chris.
I would like to invite all the people present
Yeah.
to my home on January 5th at 5 o'clock. I'll send another blurb out to you to send out.
I can pass it on.
I do a feast of stories. Storytellers from Long Beach and South Coast, and John and some of the people from here and myself and others tell Season of Joy stories. I hot smoke tri-tips.
Oh.
And Tito's au gratin, and water. And people bring stuff to share. And if you walk away from this event hungry, it's because you refuse to eat.
Yes,
We
you
have a
can
great
bring a
time.
salad or a dessert.
And I will start off the storytelling with the thing that started my 12th night division day, and I will end the night with the puppy Flora as I've done these last, I don't know, 8-10 years. And hopefully every storyteller present and everyone you can drag in from anywhere in the state of California will have a story to share. Only requirement is that it be a Season of Joy story.
Great. Thank you for creating animals.
I think I've been, well, I think this is my 31st actual event. I started at 34 years ago, but there was this minor thing that sort of interfered with 3 years.
Yes. We actually did it once on Zoom.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
isn't this good bit?
Yeah, right, yeah. So this was our second trial meeting here at this place. I did get a key now, so I don't have to coordinate with the person to meet here to get the key and wait for her to come back to lock up, which will make it much more convenient.
Yeah.
I'm thinking this is a nice facility. What do the rest of you think?
I think this has got everything we need.
Perfect. It's certainly much more quiet than the other place, which
Yeah.
had become an issue. And we just have to be really careful not to damage any of the artwork. And we have to put everything back the way we found it. And there, there is some setup, although we have set up chairs at the other place too, so. All right, I'll go ahead and tell the Claremont Forum we're no longer going to rent their space. And,
Too much noise.
yes.
Way too much.
So help yourself to. And I'm gonna end. Bye, Ina. Thank you for joining us.
You make great animal sounds.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I have fun doing that.
How did you fix them?
I-